Hello, I'm Grin Grimsley, and welcome to Grin Reviews. You know, there's some days where you feel like doing nothing other than heading down to the local speedway and taking a spin in your own personal Formula One car. But for those of us who just don't have time to get to the track, there's Pole Position for the Atari 2600.
Pole Position may very well be the most 80s cartoon to come out of the 80s. In fact, it may well even not be going too far to insinuate that in the competition for most 80s cartoon to come out of the 80s, Pole Position may very well hold pole position. The show is about a group of recently orphaned children who are operating a crime-fighting team called Pole Position out of a stunt driving show, which, along with the crime-fighting team, was previously ran by their parents. They have a lovable pet companion, and their cars are full of gadgets and can even talk to them. Which, this show came out in 1984, only 2 years after Knight Rider began, so it's pretty clear where they drew their inspiration from. The show is essentially Knight Rider for kids with less David Hasselhoff. However, unfortunately, it has not aged well and is definitely a difficult show to go back and watch. The stories are just not that great, the pacing is very painfully slow, and the voice acting can be sometimes grating. In fact, the only thing about the show that still holds up today is the wicked 80s theme song with shredding hair metal vocals. And so since the show has dated so poorly, it should probably not surprise anyone that when it came to making a video game adaptation of the show, they chose to incorporate in the game very few of the show's story elements. However, despite Pole Position the game differing greatly from the cartoon of which it shares a name, the game is still easily the best racing game I've ever played, one of the best games in general I've ever played, and almost indisputably the best looking game I've ever seen. And so on that subject, since it's probably the first thing you immediately notice when turning on the game, let's get talking about the graphics, which are nothing short of breathtaking. If you were to compare it with the only other racing game I've ever played, the difference is day and night. Literally, because the other game is Knight Driver. However, moving past that pun, when I was reviewing Knight Driver for the Atari 2600, I lamented that the graphics in some areas, especially regarding the car you drive, look so poorly done, especially considering that other objects in the game, such as your opponent's vehicles and random background objects, look so comparatively excellent. And while I did in fact laud the lights coming towards you as a method to represent where the road was, and did an excellent job of adding a sense of speed, they really weren't much to look at. However, if we move on over to look at Pole Position, well, the graphics are just completely staggering. The car you're driving is very clearly a Formula One, and it very much looks like one with no imagination needed. This is where I would put up footage of a Formula One car racing in real life as evidence, but unfortunately the copyright owners for Formula One are particularly aggressive, so I'm not going to show that. But what I will show is the artwork from the front of the cartridge, which looks like the car you're driving, so good job on that. Unfortunately, the car behind you in the picture on the cartridge looks absolutely nothing like your opponent's cars in the game, though I'm not really complaining about that. If you're going to skimp on graphics anywhere, which is pretty much a necessity on the Atari 2600 due to limitations, I'd rather you do so on the opponent's vehicles that pass you quickly, rather than the car you're driving and so staring at the back of for the entire game. To do the opposite would make absolutely no sense and would be complete lunacy. Looking at you, Knight Driver. Though it's so very obvious that it can probably go without being said, but the cars in the game are not the only graphical thing worth mentioning, as indeed there's also the track, the foreground, and even a surprisingly detailed background. However, mere graphics alone don't really mean much, and if this were just a pretty picture, while it would still be pretty, a good game it would make not. Though fortunately this is not the case when it comes to Pole Position, as every single piece of graphics in the game is not only extremely impressive, but also adds another level of functionality and realism to the game. What I mean by this is that the graphics don't just serve to make the game look good, but they also give you visual information about what's going on. For instance, to hark back to Knight Driver, I complained that there's no animation for the car you're driving to show that it's turning left or right, and due to this combined with the stark background of the game, it was sometimes difficult to tell just how sharply you were turning, or even if you were turning at all. It became really easy to understeer or indeed oversteer. However, in pole position, not only have they given us a turning animation, which is even more impressive than the banking animation from River Raid, but also even given us a moving background that helps feel like we're actually moving around a track rather than just endlessly moving randomly through a dark void. And yes, indeed, I did say track. Unlike Night Drive's seemingly completely random stretch of road that endlessly stretches in front of you, pole position has an actual track layout, and if you pay close enough attention to what you're doing, you would notice that you're actually doing circuits of the course. Now, to be completely honest, I, in reality, never paid close attention to this. I was too busy making sure to avoid other drivers and making sure to stay off of the walls. And as it turns out, you really don't need to know where you are on the track to do a pretty okay job. However, that said, I cannot help but praise the extra level of detail and realism they put into the map, and even if I wasn't paying close attention to it, on a subconscious level, I'm sure it adds to the overall enjoyment of the game and almost certainly your improvement of the game, because instead of just endlessly driving on a randomly generated course appearing in front of you, you're actually going around the same track and doing laps of it, so even if you don't know you're doing it, you're probably subconsciously getting better at what you're doing. Though let's now move past the graphics and start talking about the gameplay, which, much like the graphics, are expertly crafted. And since we have been comparing elements of this game to Night Driver, I feel the first thing we need to mention when talking about gameplay is the controls, or more accurately, the controller. You see, to play Night Driver, you utilize a paddle controller, which I thought was extremely cool and fitting, as turning the dial was at least somewhat like turning a steering wheel, adding an extra level of realism. Though over on pole position, I was at first a little bit disappointed that it had reverted back to utilizing the pleasure stick. However, as you may well have just noticed, I said at first, and indeed, my opinion rather quickly changed on this control choice. You see, while it is slightly disappointing that to turn left you push your pleasure stick left, and to turn right you push your pleasure stick right, which is definitely not as immersive as it would be to use the dial on the paddle controller, the game more than makes up for this with the fact that you can actually change your gears by pushing forward and pulling backwards on your pleasure stick. The game, much like driving a real Formula 1 car, gives you the option of switching between two gears, high and low, which adds an entire another dimension to the gameplay. You're no longer just trying to make sure your car is moving fast and not running into anything, but you're also making sure to be in the high gear when you're moving fast and low gear while trying to get up to speed. On top of this, I really appreciate that the red button is not the accelerator, but instead the brake, and your vehicle is just always accelerating. Because of this, I never use the red button, because why wouldn't I want to be speeding up? And it's just neat that the game developers realize that if you're playing a racing game, you of course want to go fast, and rather than forcing you to constantly hold down the red button, they just instead do the job for you. It's a really simple innovation, but it didn't go unnoticed, and it certainly did not go unappreciated. And of course, the main point of pole position is to drive fast and rack up a high number on the scoreboard on the top of the screen there, in which you get points for the distance you go within a time limit, and you also get points for passing cars. The only downside in the entire game is that as the game goes, your opponents become increasingly erratic and basically purposely steer into you. Towards the end of each race, it didn't feel so much like it was a driving simulator, but instead a road rage simulator, as I found myself yelling at the TV screen because of my opponents purposely blocking me, resulting in fiery explosions. Though that aside, I do understand why they did it, as it was basically the only way they could add difficulty later into the game, and it does definitely get your adrenaline spiking as you swerve to avoid your opponents. It's a really fun game to play, and I cannot get over just how much I enjoy this driving. And so whether you're on the curve or a face in adventure in the danger zone, then head down to your local video store and pick up a copy of Pole Position for the Atari 2600.
From now on, like your parents were, you are the secret board of Pole.
They're moving real fast, they're the only one who can get there on time. They're never too far behind, they're always fighting crime. Undercover, facing adventure in the danger zone. Pretty soon they'll be off on a mission. Come and watch them go. Bright doesn't shine. What's the highest and show? Bright doesn't shine. Only the
Thanks for watching, and before this video ends, we'd just like to take this opportunity to give a huge thank you and shout out to Bad Art Labs for allowing us to use their completely slaying cover of the Pole Position theme song. The links on the left side of the screen will take you to the original video and allow you to subscribe to their channel, so make sure to send them some love.